welcome to WhitTips. Today we're going to be looking at Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We're going to start by looking at the final chapter, which is entitled Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. In some ways this is mise en abîme in the sense that it's a story within a story. It's the story itself, really. The last 9 chapters, or the previous 9 chapters, sorry, are all kind of brought together here as Henry Jekyll summarises, really, I suppose, what we could call a confession of what he's done. He tries to give us some kind of rationale for what he's done and the things that he's done throughout this novel. In some areas, we might think of this as, or his character as kind of boastful. In some ways, we might think of him as repenting. Some ways, we may just think of him evaluating exactly what he's done or reflecting on the things that we've done. The biggest thing I think we need to try and engage as readers is, can we trust him? Is he a reliable narrator to us, or is he an unreliable narrator? And that's a big question that we've got at the end of this novel. Stevenson leaves the reader thinking about Dr. Jekyll's intentions. I think we see from the title of this final chapter, he's referred to by his name, Henry Jekyll, and we know from chapter 3, Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. We see the loss of title in his name in this final chapter. Stevenson refers to him by his Christian name of Henry. I suppose hinting here that he is now a fallen character. The loss of the title emphasises the fact that he is now perhaps fallen in Victorian society as he comes clean with the deeds and the deviant acts that he has done. So at the beginning of chapter 10, Stevenson shows us Dr. Henry Jekyll's formative years, taking us right back to his childhood, where some of his urges perhaps manifested themselves. We're told that he inherited a large fortune. This becomes as much of a burden for the young Dr. Henry Jekyll as it does a blessing, because this gives him then a title, a reputation, something, a mark of wealth within society for which people look upon him and expect him to behave in a certain Victorian gentlemanly type of way. He is very much a member of the upper classes of his day and quite well respected, and that means with that his behaviour must also be respectable. But he very quickly goes on to tell us how he concealed his pleasures. Stevenson is very clever here because he never actually states explicitly what these pleasures may be. They become perhaps the most enigmatic part of the puzzle for the reader. We want to know what it is that Dr. Jekyll, both the young Dr. Jekyll and also Mr. Hyde later on in the novel, actually engage in. But he does say something very important. He does say that he hid his pleasures. He had to hide them. So whatever it is, it's a taboo of the times. So it's something that can't be done, or can't be done for a Victorian gentleman like Dr. Jekyll. Because whatever these pleasures do, they bring about them a morbid sense of shame. This, understandably, will lead the reader into thinking that they might be quite deviant acts, maybe even criminal acts, maybe sexual acts as well, but something that are going to bring shame, are going to be something along those lines. As chapter 10 progresses, rather than hide this morbid sense of shame, Dr. Jekyll tells us that he plunges himself into it, plunged into shame, whatever this shame might be. He says the shame and the fact that whatever he does, his shameful acts or shameful sins that he commits, coexist with himself. He has periods where he is both good and periods where he's working hard and he's furthering his knowledge, and he has periods of where he's bad as well, where he plunges himself into shame and probably commits these deviant acts. And again, we can go back to this idea of the furthering of the knowledge. What is it that he wants to find out? Is it something that he's finding out about himself as he plunges himself into shame? Is it something he's finding out about others? Because this sense of sorrow that it creates makes us think maybe of an unrequited love, or perhaps a restricted love, maybe an illegal love in some way, maybe an homoerotic love for the time, because it brings him suffering, maybe brings others suffering as well. So there is a sense of sympathy growing for Dr. Jekyll here, but let's not be too sorry for the man at this moment in time. We then land on what is perhaps the most important quotation in the novella, when Dr. Jekyll tells us that man is not truly one, but truly two, within each of us in maybe equal or in slightly imbalanced parts. There is good and there is evil, and he calls this the curse of mankind. He uses some strange, perhaps to go back to the title word of the novella, imagery in doing this. He talks about incongruous faggots, this idea of a faggot, of something being bound together. He's talking about good and evil here, but there might be something in Stevenson's language. There might be some punning, there might be some wordplay going on, there might be some hints as, again, what these deviant pleasures Dr. Jekyll is trying to conceal here. And especially if we look a little bit further in the extract, and we see very close to that is this idea or this image that this incongruous faggot is bound together with the agonised womb of consciousness. Again, it's a strange phrase here, this agonised womb, and the pre-modification of the womb as some kind of bringing agony to Stevenson, but not maybe to Stevenson, but bringing agony to the character of Dr. Jekyll, might also lead us down a path or reveal to us a hint of what these deviant pleasures it is that he's so keen to conceal within Victorian society. Either way, we have now got this battle running through Dr. Jekyll here of this good Dr. Jekyll and this slightly deviant Dr. Jekyll as he tries to manage the two different entities that he believes exists within himself. So the large fortune that he inherited then allows Dr. Henry Jekyll the luxury of being able to afford some fine salts and to be able to conduct experiments which allows him to separate the good and the evil, and this allows him then to become a brand new person. Well, not quite a brand new person, but part of a new person, and straight away this person is named. There's not really much reference to the naming of Mr. Edward Hyde, the person that comes from Dr. Jekyll, but the name itself is quite an interesting choice from Stevenson, and it makes us think about the nomenclature, the naming for effect here. And what we've got in this is obviously the homophone Hyde, with its different connotations. Hyde linking and connoting the skin, suggesting that there is something within our skin that might be evil trying to escape out. Also, this idea of hiding links massively to the Victorian views of secrets, reputation, hiding things away, and concealing his pleasures. We go back to that quotation again. But actually, the Christian name Edward has perhaps got some legs in it in terms of analysis as well. The word Edward literally means rich guard. This idea that there is a guardian, a protector of wealth, and that's what Mr. Hyde does. He allows Dr. Jekyll, or he protects Dr. Jekyll's wealth, his status, his reputation, as well as letting him do these deviant acts. Dr. Jekyll does say, though, which might give us some sympathy for his character, not me, but it might do for you, that he's 9/10 good, that he toils every day for virtue, and he puts a lot of effort into that to be 9/10 good. He's not bad, he's not a bad person, there's only 1/10 of him bad, so that's only probably 5 years of his 50 years on this planet that he's done bad, deviant things, and roughly about 2 hours a day. But Mr. Hyde is a completely different character. He is pure evil, the creation of Mr. Hyde, and I think that word creation is an important word to consider there, because it is Dr. Henry Jekyll that creates Mr. Hyde, and by creating him, by saying that he is pure evil, this pure evil is something that's coming from within Dr. Jekyll. And again, the enigmatic part of us and the enigmatic part of this text is to try and work out what this evil is. Okay, this evil that's been released. What is the evil? How do we stop it? How do we control it? How do we release it? How do we manage it? I suppose this is the idea that there are inner demons within all of us, and that's why it works so well as a Gothic text, and probably why it was so successful and so scary and frightening at the time, because this idea of the Gothic as a genre was moving from remote castles and landscapes, and what I suppose Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde did was it brought the Gothic not just within perhaps the urban streets of London or any large industrial city at the time. It brought the Gothic into the body, and actually within each and every one of our bodies there is this idea of transgression and boundaries and binaries of good and evil, and if we're not careful it might just slip out, and that's quite horrifying. pure evil than he might have been. However, the three comparative adjectives lighter, happier, and younger, and especially younger, show that there are many benefits perhaps from taking this drug, this compound, this transcendental medicine of the mind that Dr. Jekyll had created. Who would not want to feel lighter, happier, and indeed younger, especially as a 50-year-old Victorian bachelor? And we can see as we look at this next passage here, he reflects upon his body. He refers to himself as an elderly man. Perhaps his body is what's letting him down here. This is as much perhaps an exploration of Dr. Jekyll's memory and mind through the vehicle of Edward Hyde as anything else. This idea that he is now too old to live out and act upon his urges, whatever they might be, but he can still remember them. Okay, and Edward Hyde comes almost out of Dr. Jekyll's memory here. He still talks about his pleasures. They're still post-modified with this phrase undignified. We still don't know what that means. Stevenson is very clever here as he uses the page as some kind of mirror in the fact that he holds it up, and what we see as undignified pleasures, they are bespoke to each of us, and they're our own personal evils that we see on the page. We never actually see what Dr. Jekyll's evils are. However, he does give in to temptation. His desires overcome, and he says that he fell into slavery. Drinking this compound makes him fall into slavery. He becomes a slave to his urges, to his desires here, and he's had to give in to them because he loves them so much. He loves the feeling of them so much. He becomes addicted to them, and to the addict, the drug of choice is always more. And more is what he keeps going back to. He keeps going back to this term about his pleasures. He can't let his pleasures go. And this is going back to what I started this off with, this idea of the confession, but not confession, this self-indulgent, this boastfulness to the character of Dr. Henry Jekyll here, at the fact that not only is he boasting about he's clever enough and intellectual enough and rich enough to be able to make this compound, but also there's an element of boasting and almost mockery of the fact that he can do these deviant, criminal, whatever acts that he gets up to, and he's never caught for it. And we know this idea of very high criminals, they like the fame, and he wants to be recognised not only for his scientific efforts but maybe also for his criminal ones as well. There's a key quotation in this extract that you can see on screen now, and it's one that I quite like. He refers to Edward Hyde as my disguise, and I think this is a very important quotation because this seems to suggest through the possessive pronoun my that this idea that it's just a disguise, that nothing really in terms of anatomy changes. Perhaps this is just this idea, he's not going through this perhaps big massive metamorphosis, if you will, this big change that's happening to him. It's just really he's putting on a disguise. He is the same person. He is Dr. Henry Jekyll in disguise. And then he says, slightly perhaps hyperbolic, and we might start to think of Edward Hyde as some kind of victim in all of this here as well. He says that in the hands of Edward Hyde that his pleasures turned more monstrous. I would argue against this. I'm not sure that it's Edward Hyde that's the monster in here, but it's perhaps the boldness, it's the liberty, it's the freedom of the character of Dr. Henry Jekyll to think that he's beyond the realm of persecution and being caught and having his reputation damaged in any way, shape or form. And shape and form are very important things in this, that he has got this newfound confidence. He can be bolder, he can be darker, he can be more deviant, more criminal, more whatever it is that he wants to do, and indulge in his pleasures more. And this all links to this idea of excess, and this is a very key Gothic theme as well, this idea of the excess. And what Dr. Henry Jekyll does is he takes great pleasure in the excess here. Also in this extract, there's a hint at the supernatural, and again, going back to the name Edward here, this idea of Edward Hyde as this familiar, this supernatural being that also protects. And we get really in chapter 10 the only hints of perhaps what the deviancy of Dr. Jekyll could be. And they talk about drinking pleasures, so somebody that drinks a lot, this bestial avidity of any degree of torture to another. That's the only hint, really. Whatever it is that Dr. Jekyll does, Robert Louis Stevenson is considering it to be some kind of torture to Edward Hyde, to Henry Jekyll, to other people, whatever that might be. Again, we're still curious, suspicious, and perhaps very much in a state of wonder here to find out what that might be. In this extract that you can see on screen now, we see refer to the power of the drug here, and Dr. Jekyll hints that the drug was not always equal, it didn't always work. So despite making this drug, it was a little bit hit and miss, is what he was saying here. And what you've got, I suppose, is an admittal here, a loss of control. That's what he admits, Dr. Henry Jekyll. He admits that he's now losing control, and he has to double his dose in order to change back from Mr. Hyde, which seems to be an easier transformation, an easier metamorphosis, to turn or to return back to the character of Dr. Jekyll, which is the good character. There is a sense of irony here, the fact that he's got to double his dose, because it's his double, his doppelganger, if you will, Mr. Hyde, that's refusing to live up to his name, because he's not hiding anymore. And Dr. Jekyll's risk, I suppose, of this is that he's willing to risk death by doubling and trebling this dose to return back to Henry Jekyll. But what he's willing to risk, actually, is his pleasures again, and satisfying his urges and his pleasures. He will risk death in order to keep being Mr. Hyde, to keep wearing his disguise, to return back to that quotation, because he gets and he derives so much pleasure from being Mr. Hyde and committing his deviant, violent acts, whatever they may be. Dr. Jekyll's attempts then to suppress Hyde, he tries, after this loss of control, to regain control, fail miserably. He can't control the Mr. Hyde that's within him, this 1/10 evil, pure evil. And in fact, after he has tried to suppress it, it makes matters worse. It makes Hyde hungrier, for the want of a better word. And he talks about this idea that his devil comes out roaring, if you will. The devil, this idea, this image of the chief of sinners, to go back to a quotation earlier in the novel. The spirit of hell, he calls him, coming out roaring. It's quite a frightening image again, that now Hyde has got this taste for it. We've talked about him becoming perhaps more monstrous in his pleasures. But here we see Dr. Jekyll referring to and maybe enjoying the memory of Sir Danvers Carew's murder here, as he talks about how Edward Hyde mauled the unresisting body, which is a nice image there. It's got there's an element of the animalistic here in Mr. Hyde, and there is quite pretty much throughout the novel, which links, I suppose, to regression, links to the Darwinism in there as well. There is this element of zoomorphism, tasting the delight. There is a hint, almost, of cannibalism in here as well, but it's this fearsome monster, if you will, and the image of mauling the unresisting body. He does prey on the vulnerable, Mr. Hyde. That's something to look at there. All the incidents that we see in the book, the incident of the trampling of the girl, the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, an aged, old, beautiful gentleman, he does prey on the vulnerable, and he does seem to enjoy whatever it is that he does to them, which seems to be, at this moment, acts of violence as well. But you can't control this. This is something now that is massively out of control. Hyde is out of control, but it's not really Hyde that's out of control. It's Dr. Jekyll that's out of control, through his disguise, if you will, of Mr. Hyde. However, the murder of Sir Danvers Carew was a step too far, and it's probably the most shocking part of it, especially with the audibly broken bones that we can hear, so much so that the maid who witnesses this faints. Let's start with the second quotation here. Jekyll, metaphorically, there's a use of metaphor here from Stevenson, becomes the city of refuge for Edward Hyde. Interesting quotation this. Jekyll, my city of refuge. Who is talking to us here through this novel? This is the Dr. Henry Jekyll's full account. So is this Dr. Henry Jekyll referring to himself in the third person, and it's Jekyll that's coming to his help? Is this Mr. Hyde's voice? Is this both's voice? There is some sort of confusion here, and there is this sense again of role reversal, if you will, because no longer is it Edward Hyde, Edward being the protector of this large. It's actually now, ironically, the large fortune, the burden that he had at the beginning of this chapter for Dr. Henry Jekyll, that comes to be the saving grace, if you will, because it's the large fortune, it's the reputation, it's the title that Dr. Jekyll has that can help keep this criminal hidebound and safe from the law, to be able to come out and roar again whenever Dr. Jekyll summons this familiar up to do his deviant act, and to engage and enjoy in his pleasures. The first quotation I find quite a fascinating one, and I'm not 100% sure why really, but this idea that Jekyll had more than a father's interest and Hyde more than a son's indifference. Stevenson alludes to the fact that this relationship between the two is as close as a parent and child one, um, but it's more than that. We see the comparative adjective more being used here. Hyde has more than a son's indifference, as much as a son doesn't listen to his father, doesn't care, a lack of concern for his father and empathy and sympathy. Hyde has more than that, so he doesn't really look to Dr. Jekyll as a father per se, or creator, if you will, but Dr. Jekyll here has more than a father's interest. I find it's a curious quotation. What would, and I suppose this is something you can interpret yourself, what would more than a father's interest mean here? Is it again because it's something that's part of him and it's something that he wants to protect? Is there again an erotic part to this quotation, in some way incestual? What is it? What does that mean? That's all, I suppose, all for you for your interpretations there. I just find it a very curious quotation. I thought it needed including, especially because a little bit later there's more reference to the father. And perhaps Stevenson, we know contextually, had issues with his own father. He fell out with his own father. They had a different views with his own father, and here we can see Jekyll and Hyde being alluded to, father and son, having very, very different views, but actually working together to create one super force in society, to create both good and evil. However, the city of refuge that is Dr. Henry Jekyll doesn't last too long. Dr. Jekyll, although successful in hiding away Edward Hyde from Victorian society following Sir Danvers Carew murder for some time, is unable to stop his own temptations. He talks about his own person, and he talks about, again, this idea that he becomes an ordinary secret sinner, tempted to trifle with conscience. Even as Dr. Henry Jekyll, he's still committing these deviant acts, whatever they may be. He's still too weak to refuse his pleasures. So even though Mr. Hyde goes missing, the sinful nature of Dr. Jekyll is still very much there, but he then has to make more of a conscious effort, if you will, to hide them away, because he can't use his vehicle or his disguise of Mr. Hyde anymore. And perhaps the unsatisfaction in this comes in the fact that he can't live perhaps those more monstrous desires that he has. He can't do them perhaps as frequent, and he can't do them perhaps as open as he has been doing under the disguise of Mr. Hyde, and he finds that a great source of frustration, and something has to give. That something gives with a very public display, because the animal within, Mr. Hyde within, licking the chops of a memory, escapes out. It publicly pops out at will whilst he's sat in a park, and he looks down and sees he's beginning to start to change, transform, metamorphose again there. This is a source of great fear for Dr. Henry Jekyll, because he knows that Mr. Hyde, he refers to him as the quarry of mankind, the hunted, and rightly so. Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll are wanted for their criminal / deviant acts and behaviour. Again, whatever they may be, we know one of them is murder, but we don't know to the full extent of what it is that he's been getting up to with his nocturnal activities. So Dr. Jekyll takes the only option that's left to him then. He locks them both away for the good. We see that at the incident of the window. They're locked away. He becomes self-exiled, if you will, for the safety of himself, for the safety of Edward Hyde, and for the safety of Victorian society. He locks them away. This is an important thing, really, and we see here, even locked away, even in a room where there is just Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we see Hyde's, perhaps naughtiness is too tame a word. Stevenson again goes back to the image of ape-like, the simile ape-like here, because we can see here, perhaps more so than anywhere else, the idea of regression, the descent of man from Charles Darwin, if you will, this turning away of religion, and this idea that if we've evolved from apes, that we could regress back into apes or animalistic type behaviour, because we see Mr. Hyde writing blasphemies all over the work of Dr. Jekyll. So this idea again of turning and degrading religion in some way. We see Mr. Hyde destroying letters, novels, books. Again, these are marks, these are symbols of civilized man. And Mr. Hyde destroys them, burns them, tears them up, destroys them. So that's quite an important thing. And the final image here is quite again, it's another reference to the father here, destroying the portrait of the father. Again, we've talked already about Stevenson's disagreement with the father, but here we can see Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll falling out like father and son, but the destruction of his father's portrait is quite a damning one, and it perhaps draws some kind of Freudian deep psychoanalytical comparisons with the Oedipus complex here, this destruction of the father, and again the father might connote God here, the destruction of God in this scene, which is again a source of Victorian fear, and the boundaries that religion perhaps imposed upon Victorian society, the commandments, the sins, the good life that Christians lead, with this idea that there are other ways to live life, and Mr. Hyde embodies them, and that's another source, great source of Victorian fear within this novel. And Dr. Jekyll now is powerless to stop Mr. Hyde, is powerless to stop his desires. We could say powerless, we could almost argue he's not powerless, he just doesn't want to. He says that every time he falls asleep now he's awaking as Mr. Hyde, and this transformation as this novella has gone on, he is now more Hyde than Jekyll. So at the beginning, when he was talking about being 9/10 good, 1/10 bad, and 1/10 pure evil, he is now more Hyde. He is now more pure evil, pure deviancy, pure criminal, pure wrong, whatever it might be, than he is good. And there is this attempt, if you will, if you want to believe it. I know some people will believe this idea. There's an attempt at sympathy there with this idea that Dr. Jekyll is now the person that's caged in his flesh. So the kind of, again, go back to this idea of role reversal. He's now caged in his flesh. Dr. Jekyll can't escape Mr. Hyde. Now, again, we had the quotation from earlier in the novel of Hyde bound. Dr. Jekyll is the one that's caged, literally, metaphorically. He won't come out of his house, and he can't escape. He can't get out of his body some days as well. So we might feel sympathy for him in the fact that he's caged, he's locked up, and we might therefore feel sorry for him. But he has brought this on himself. He is in the pursuit and the desperate pursuit for one's desires and pleasures that have led this man, this great man at one point, celebrated man, to ruin. And to the very end, now we see again here on this slide that Dr. Jekyll refers to Mr. Hyde as the child, his child, the child of hell. There is nothing now within this child of hell but fear and hatred, two very disturbing characteristics to have. Also, we see him at the end, desperate, if you will, to find this salt, and he talks about having a contaminated batch of salt that actually made the experiment work and actually made him turn into this lighter, younger, happier person. But now he can't find the salt. He has London, as he says, ransacked to try and find this salt, but none of the salts work, and his control has completely gone now, and he realises this. What he's opened essentially is Pandora's box. Out has crawled this pure evil being, and he can't get it back in. He comes out roaring constantly, and he's spending more time, as we've said, as Hyde than he is as Jekyll. And the very last line of this novella, again, is this idea of him bringing his suicide. He knows his suicide's got to come about. Interestingly, he dies as Hyde, which is probably a sign, maybe from Stevenson, as one final act to perhaps say, this is not Dr. Jekyll's doing, this is Mr. Hyde's work. So one last act of a sympathy perhaps from Stevenson for Dr. Jekyll's character, that he dies as Mr. Hyde, and he dies and he commits suicide as the person who has committed the majority of these sins. But there is a sense of woe is me here, this unhappy life of Henry Jekyll. Note the loss of title there, the loss of reputation. He is now a criminal deviant with nothing positive to look towards in society anymore. His unhappy life, though, has been brought to an end, and this idea with the prefix un there is another word that we could perhaps use here, and he is perhaps undeserving of our sympathy. Dr. Henry Jekyll has lived a life of wealth, of excess, of deviant pleasures, and my view of this is that there is actually no need to feel unhappiness for the death of Dr. Jekyll. Perhaps we should be glad that somebody as dangerous and as deviant as him is no longer on the Victorian streets of London.